Just to start this morning, I want you to imagine you having a friend who really had no God awareness, a friend that was sort of far from God, and yet somehow they discovered that you could have this personal relationship with God. And it became real to them. They even started to find that songs like we've just sung, worship songs, meant something to them. They could experience God in those times. They started to find a biblical worldview. And imagine this friend over a 13-year period goes from never really having any God awareness to actually feeling loved by God, to be part of a church family, to worship and understand God's truth. Would that friend, in that 13 years, this is my question to you this morning, would that friend's mental health have improved? Would their sense of well-being, would their sense of joy and happiness in life, would that have improved? Now, I know that you're sitting there and you're nodding and you want to say yes, but deep down some of you are thinking, is this a trick question? Where's Lex going with this? Well, if you're saying yes to that question, you should be right. But what I'm about to read out to you, it's a verse, and this verse, if you're saying yes, this verse should leave you shaking your head and going, no, what's going on? Something's wrong here. Like, this shouldn't be the story. So I'm going to read this verse out to you, and it's found in the opening chapter of Nehemiah. It's a second verse, and this is what it says. Here's the verse. One of my brothers came back from Judah with some other men. And I question, this is Nehemiah, there's a contingent come back from Jerusalem to Babylon, and he's asking them, and he asks them this, a question about the Jewish remnant, 50,000 people that have gone back to Jerusalem. He says, how's it going with them? Simple question. And this is what he's told, that they're in great trouble, they're in distress, disgrace, that there's this great affliction. The New King James says that they are in great distress and in reproach. Another Bible translation says they're all in great trouble. It doesn't make sense. It shouldn't be that. Like, Ezra has taken this 50,000 people back from Babylon to Jerusalem 13 years earlier with one purpose. That is to rebuild the temple, to rebuild temple worship, to put God in the centre of these people's lives. There's a list of all the people who went back. There's male and female servants and all the numbers. There's male and female worship leaders and singers, 200 of them. There's all their animals, they're all listed. Like, there's mules. Well, 245 mules went back with them. Well, it doesn't matter if they're male and female because mules can't breed, but the details there, these are real people with real possessions, real lives, and they've grown up in a foreign country. They've never experienced God for real like they could back in Jerusalem with a temple. They've never worshipped in a temple. And this 50,000 go back to leave this secular country and to experience God for real in their life. They've now established daily prayers in the temple. There's temple worship on a weekend, like on the Sabbath, every week. There's festivals they're celebrating, the sacrifices they're doing. They got so committed to this that 110 men who had previously married foreign women willingly allowed them to have their marriages annulled. They gave their wives letters of divorce and sent their children and their wives away because they were so committed to what they're trying to do. Now, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying this is what happened 2,500 years ago. But they're doing all this. They're worshipping God. They're connected to God. They're following what the Torah, what the Old Testament says, God's law. And they're distressed. They're in strife. Something's going wrong in their life. And it shouldn't be that way, surely. And when Jesus told us to go into all the world and make disciples, that concept of a disciple has its origins, its Jewish origins, all go back to this time with Ezra and Nehemiah, when they're establishing the worship in the temple. And these people we're talking about that are in distress, they are the first disciples that had ever been known in Jewish culture. And they're in strife. Now, just to be clear, the two words that are translated from the Hebrew, this is what they mean, describing the problems they're in. It means that they're in misery, they're hurting, they're sad, they're depressed, they're emotionally finished. In fact, the NIV translates one of those words, says disgrace. And the root, the origin of that word is to surrender, to give up. And that's the place they've got to. But why? Why are they, what's going on here? Well, verse 2 tells us the problem, but verse 2 also tells us why. And this is what it says. The wall of Jerusalem is broken down. The gates have been burned with fire. The city wall back in those days was there as a boundary. It was there to protect and keep safe all those within the city. It was to protect the good and to keep the bad out. You can know God. You can feel loved by God. You can even argue and defend biblical truth. You can be experiencing God in worship even weekly. And yet your life can be a mess. You can be stressed. You can be depressed. You can be anxious. You can feel like the enemy has an open go at you because your walls are broken down, because your gates have been burnt by fire. And depression, anxiety, and insecurity can just come in and have a go at you, almost at will. For some of you, relationally, you know that you're very vulnerable, because there's some of you that have been sexually abused as a child or as a young teenager, and that wasn't your fault. Someone else broke down your walls. Someone else destroyed the boundaries that should have been there around your life, and that's left you vulnerable. For some of you, you've been involved sexually outside of marriage, and that destroys your walls. Like pornography is like taking a wrecking ball to the boundaries that God ordained around our life, and it opens us up to enemy attack. There's so many ways, so many areas of our life that the walls get broken down, the boundaries get knocked over, and it makes us vulnerable in so many different directions and areas of our life. Your life is defined by your boundaries. Boundaries are not so much about what you do, they have everything to do with what you don't do. My dad had a quick temper. Like, I know, I brought it out in him, right? I got him at his best, and it was quick, bang, he would explode. He was very task-focused. Yet, growing up, honestly, Dad, very opinionated, but never once did I hear Mum and Dad arguing. Never once did I hear my dad raise his voice at Mum. Never. It's a boundary he never crossed. And in those last moments when I said my last words on earth to my dad, when I said farewell to him, in that moment, I thanked him for showing me how to love my wife. See, the boundary that Dad wouldn't cross, the boundary that Dad built in his life, those sorts of boundaries become generational. They aren't there just for Dad. It's become generational. It's a blessing that I've grown up into. And sadly, broken walls, For some of you, you've grown up in a family that can't tell that story. There's a broken wall in your family of origin, and those walls, when they stay broken, they become generational. For 150 years, the walls of Jerusalem lay in ruins. 52 days. 52 days they rebuilt the walls. It doesn't have to be a long process. But for it to begin, someone has to be bothered by what other people aren't bothered by. If it's a family, someone has to begin. Someone has to take initiative to rebuild the broken walls, the boundaries. If you're an individual living by yourself, dependent just on you, then it's just you. You're the only one that can restore the broken walls. Someone has to care. Nehemiah cared. And when he arrived in Jerusalem, he went out at night and he quietly, without a whole lot of attention, without a whole lot of people's opinions telling him what was going on, he went and assessed the brokenness of the walls. And I think there's a place in all our lives to just stop and maybe with a close friend, but not with the noise of life. Just have a look. Are there broken walls? Are there boundaries that are down in my life? Is that behind why I feel so stressed? Why things aren't going the way I think they should? Here's the thing. Ezra, when he came back 13 years earlier to establish temple worship and rebuild the temple, the enemy had a bit of a go at him, but mainly politically. Political letters, sort of little stuff behind the scenes, but really not much opposition. And there's an enemy that doesn't want you to worship God. That's true. But if you dare to rebuild the walls, if you dare to re-establish the foundations, the boundaries of your life that have been pulled down, the enemy will throw everything he can at you. And the story of Nehemiah shows us how brilliantly the strategies that God gave Nehemiah to combat the intimidation, the threats of the enemy. And those boundaries are God-breathed limitations, and they protect your life like nothing else can. They're like saliva. Like saliva, it's just in there. You don't even realise that every day your saliva is protecting you. It's the first line of defence of your body against things that could kill you, and you're not even aware of it. And when we put the right boundaries in place, it's like we're not even aware. There's a protection going on, and we're not having to work at it. It's just there. It's in place. And in our culture, you will not hear how to build a wall. You'll hear people talking about, oh, I put a wall up to protect myself and I've got to pull that wall down. And that's because that wall keeps out the good and the bad. I was talking to Ali this week and she was telling me that this thought that she has stayed with her for a long time is that if you think of some of the greatest memories you have in life, the top 10 memories of life, probably 8 out of those 10 will involve you and other people. Like the special moments in life we fundamentally do with other people. And in our world, in our culture, the only walls people put up are to protect themselves, but they keep the good out. Whereas God's boundaries, they only keep bad out. All the good is nourished, the good is protected, the good is kept safe. Only God's way works to achieve both outcomes. It's very difficult to live a life bigger than yourself when you're hurting and distressed and your world's collapsing around you and you don't know why. And the enemy can just have a go at you. And he attacks your identity and says, who do you think you are, to try to live bigger than yourself? But boundaries work. They really work. They're fantastic. Imagine going to an AFL game. I'm sure some of you just love your footy. And when you're at an AFL game and the ball goes over the boundary, what happens? The game stops. Because it doesn't keep going into the stands where the fans are. The ball goes over the boundary into the crowd. All the players don't jump up in the crowd and keep the game going. The game stops because something important has crossed the boundary. And then they put the ball back in. And within the freedom of the boundary, football as a game, it's brilliant. It works so well. Marriage is a boundary. And when it's a healthy boundary, when it's built without cracks in the wall, it's just this nourishing, fantastic experience in life. It's meant that for Coral and I, our two girls, Mandy and Bronnie, could grow up with a security their mum and dad would never separate. When their friends were fearful what would happen to their mum and dads, Bronnie and Mandy just knew. They didn't think we'd stay together. They knew this was for life. And the beauty of marriage, where the boundaries are healthy, there's a freedom. And for me, I know that freedom. Like, I can walk up to Carissa and I can tell her I love her. I can give her a hug. And Carissa is single. And having someone tell her they love her and that she can get a hug that's safe, it's pure, it's innocent, that's really important. And without the freedom of the boundary of marriage, that could get complicated. In the life of our church, I can ring up, even like Ali the other day, I rang up and I said, I just want to hear your voice. And the safe boundary between Coral and I and how we do life and how we do our marriage is a freedom for me to be able to help the women in our world, help the men in our world. There's no checking up on, like my phone. I can throw my phone to anyone. You can check on all my history, what I've looked at, what I haven't looked at, what's in my phone forensically. There's nothing to hide because there's boundaries in my life. And in 1995, I was in this meeting in Melbourne, a big Christian event, and God had really done something in my life, and I'm lying flat on my back under the power of God, a crowd all around me, and I was just me and God. And in that moment, I felt God's Spirit say to me, if I would keep my hands clean, He would keep His anointing on my life. He was putting a boundary in place. And that was 26 years ago. I've never crossed that boundary. And it's liberating, and it brings freedom, and it brings fruitfulness to everything in our lives. There's a verse in Proverbs, and it says this: like a city whose walls are broken down is a man who lacks self-control. God's showing us that if you lack self-control, it's particularly talking about anger, if you give yourself permission to yell in your family environment, to swear, to throw the cat through the window or kick the dog out the front door or drown the goldfish because you're angry, that's going to bring walls down. And you're going to start to wonder, why are my kids doing what they're doing? Because it knocks walls down. And in Proverbs it's saying, if you don't have control, if you don't have boundaries, you're like a city with broken walls. God's response to the distress in our life is not rules and laws. We're probably very aware right now in Victoria how rules and laws can actually create greater anxiety and greater stress. They can be damaging because they have no flexibility, no humanity attached to them. Imagine yesterday at 10:30 in the say yesterday at 1 o'clock you're getting married, and at 10:30 the bridal girls, they've all got their hair and makeup done and they're starting to get ready and everything, and then at 11 o'clock, 2 hours before you're due to get married, it's off. There's a new law. It's now illegal. It's you can't get married. The caterers, everything they've prepared, all the people that have come, it's all off. Like, that is the experience that people had yesterday with a law, a rule. And you can't blame our government because they're trying to do the best they can with a system they know. They don't have God. They only have a system of laws and rules to try and work with. But see, God's response is not laws and rules, it's compassion. And it's not just compassion, it has answers. In Isaiah 49, God's trying to show his compassion for us. And he's trying to show that he's not like a human mother or father, that his love for us goes far bigger, far wider. But he starts with this. He says, can a mother, he asks the question, can a mother forget the child she's nursed? Can she have no compassion upon a child she's given birth to? And God answers the question. He says, it's possible. It's not normal, but it's possible. But he says, I will never, ever, ever forget you. In fact, he says, see these hands of mine? I've got tattooed, I've got engraved on my hands your name, your story. And then he changes the conversation to walls. And he says, your walls, your broken down boundaries are ever before me. And then he goes on to say how he can restore all the brokenness and ends up by saying, those who hope in me will not be disappointed. God took the conversation of us feeling abandoned to a place where he said, there's broken walls, and if you'll let me rebuild them, I can rebuild your whole life. Worship is not a wall. It will not protect you. God will, if we do it his way, if we allow him. Next week, I want to look at how we rebuild walls. 52 days, Jerusalem's walls have been rebuilt. 150 years, generationally, been destroyed. 52 days. It doesn't have to be a long process. God's processes for rebuilding our life are not complicated. And I want to have a look at that next week. But before I hand over to Dave, I want to talk about a person who is connected to Red Gum. Their life right now is in crisis. Their health is in crisis. They're young. And through no fault of their own, there's a financial pressure upon them. There's a whole lot of things happened. And then there's been this family tragedy, this accident that no one could prepare for. No one could believe could ever happen. Amongst all the things that were already going on in this family's life, now this. And we can't change what's already happened. But as a church, I want us to build an emergency relief fund. And I want to invite you, like when the fires came, we had a fire relief account for you to put money into. And if you feel stirred to do something for this family right now, we're going to put up on the screen a emergency relief fund. The needs like this will keep coming. As more people get involved, more needs become obvious. And so together, we can keep this emergency fund going and we can have it there for when people are in strife and we can do something practical to help them. And sometimes just money is what's needed. So thank you. Appreciate you guys. We're going to look next week at how to rebuild these walls. And back over to you, Dave.